morning. I am here today reporting on the current status of the Union and Confederates. The Union Army was led by Major Robert Anderson. The Union is definitely not ready and prepared well enough for battle. In November 1860, Robert Anderson assumed command of all fortifications in the Charleston harbor. Major Anderson moved his command of 85 officers and men to Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter is the safest and most defensible position he can hold against attack with a limited number of men and supplies at his hand. When Anderson and his troops arrived at Fort Sumter, the fort was far from complete. For 3 months, Anderson prepared Fort Sumter. Anderson was running low on provisions. At 2 o'clock the second day, arrangements were made for Anderson to surrender the fort. Today, on April 13, 1861, the Confederate States Army has bombarded Fort Sumter, an island in Charleston Harbor. This has occurred because of the tensions between the Union and Confederate States after the election of Abraham Lincoln in November of last year, which brought to a head the issue of slavery in the United States. 7 southern states seceded from the Union rather than continuing negotiation and compromise with a government they felt would be hostile to their rights as states. The first to secede was South Carolina on December 20th. By February of this year, 6 more states had joined the new Confederate States of America. With their secession, declarations came the demands that all United States property be turned over to those states, including military property. The new Lincoln administration sought not to provoke armed conflict, but refused to surrender federal installations to the Confederates. Instead, Lincoln chose to resupply Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor and other forts when required. Negotiations continued in Charleston with Confederate General Pierre G.T. Beauregard, in command of the Confederate forces there, and Major Robert Anderson, the Sumter garrison commander. Since these talks failed to resolve tensions, Beauregard was forced to act. Early yesterday morning, Confederate guns around the harbor opened fire on Fort Sumter. At 2:30 p.m. today, Major Robert Anderson, garrison commander, surrendered the fort. Today, I am about to interview 4 spectators who have witnessed such disaster. I will first be interviewing Major Robert Anderson, the Union commander. We have him here today to answer some questions about the war and what he thinks is going to happen. What was the biggest obstacle you faced during the war?
The fort's supply of ammunition was not suited for an equal fight, and I lacked fuses for my exploding shells. Only solid shot could be used against the rebel batteries. I was always aiming to conserve ammunition, which was quite stressful. Abraham, knowing that our men and I were running out of supplies, announced his intention to send 3 unarmed ships to relieve Fort Sumter. Resupplying the fort would be seen as an act of aggression, so South Carolina militia forces soon scrambled to respond.
Did you ever think of giving up because of this lack of ammunition?
On April 9th, PGT Beauregard demanded that I surrender the fort, but obviously I refused. I can't just give up. In response, Beauregard opened fire on Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861.
Oh my, what happened after you refused? And what did you do?
After my refusal, over 3,000 militia troops besieged my garrison, and various U.S. military facilities in the Deep South had already been seized. Fort Sumter was viewed as one of the South's few remaining hurdles to overcome before achieving sovereignty. This is why I mustn't abandon. I did not want to let my people down.
So, if you didn't want to let your people down, why did you end up surrendering? And what was the outcome of this war?
With our ammunition depleted, I was sadly forced to surrender the fort shortly after 2 p.m. In the afternoon on April 13th, none of my troops had been killed during the bombardment, but 2 men sadly died the following day in an explosion that occurred during an artillery salute held before the evacuation.
Thank you for being here with us today, Robert. Now I will be interviewing Louisa Ware Seymour, an important woman figure in this battle. Now I will begin by asking you about your husband's reaction when he saw you at Fort Sumter.
Well, he wasn't very supportive of my decision, nor did he like the idea, but I still got away with it.
Why did you decide to serve and go to this battle?
Well, I personally felt indebted to my husband Truman since he serves as a Union Army soldier and did so during the battle at Fort Sumter. I felt like I could repay this hospitality and find a way to help out.
How do you think you contributed to this battle?
I secretly smuggled a number of articles intended for the use of people in the garrison, and while at Fort Sumter, I begged Major Anderson for permission to stay and help load cannons, etc. and care for the wounded, but he denied my request.
So you were one of the many women that served as spies and scouts for this battle?
Yeah, I suppose you could say that.
Well, that will be all for today, Louisa. Thank you for being here. Now I will interview PDT Beauregard. In what position did you enter?
I entered as the Confederacy's first Brigadier General and was placed in command of the defenses of Charleston, South Carolina.
How did this battle start?
A standoff ensued until January 9, 1861, when a ship called the Star of the West arrived in Charleston with over 200 U.S. troops and supplies intended for Fort Sumter. We quickly started to prepare since we saw their intentions of taking over. So our militia batteries fired upon the vessel as it neared Charleston Harbor, forcing it to turn back to the sea.
Oh my God, it's a good thing your troops were in good hands. So what happened next?
Having already declared that any attempt to resupply the fort would be seen as an act of aggression, South Carolina militia forces soon scrambled to respond. On April 11, Militia Commander 1 demanded that Anderson surrender the fort, but Anderson again refused. In response, we opened fire on Fort Sumter shortly after 4:30 a.m. on April 12.
Do you think opening fire was a good idea?
Yes, our 19 coastal batteries unleashed a punishing barrage on Fort Sumter, eventually firing an estimated 3,000 shots in 34 hours. By Saturday, April 13, cannon fire had broken through the fortress, 5-foot thick brick walls, causing fires inside the post. With Anderson's stores of ammunition depleted, he forced to surrender the fort shortly after 2 p.m. in the afternoon.
What did you get out of this win, General Beauregard?
Well, now that we have occupied Fort Sumter, my troops could possibly use it for martial defense of Charleston Harbor. Once it is complete and we are well armed, we could be able to create a valuable hole in the Union blockade of the Atlantic seaboard.
As the war began between the Union and the Confederacy, African Americans, both free and enslaved, were barred from serving in either army. Ironically, in this war, where slavery played a central role, the Union still used slave labor while denying free African American citizens the right to enlist. Objecting to this policy, we have Frederick Douglass here, whom I will be interviewing today. Douglass is a consultant to President Abraham Lincoln and convinces him that slaves should serve in the Union forces and that the abolition of slavery should be a goal of the war. What's your opinion of African American rights? What do you think should be done for your race? What can you
Why does the government reject the Negro? Is he not a man? Can he not wield the sword, fire a gun, march and counter-march, and obey orders like any other? If a person is so humble as we can be allowed to speak to the President of the United States, we should ask him if this dark and terrible hour of the nation's extremity is a time for consulting a mere vulgar and unnatural prejudice. We will tell him that this is no time to fight with one hand when both are needed. That this is no time to fight only with your white hand and allow your black hand to remain tied.
Oh my, you sure are passionate about this topic. African Americans face many discriminatory practices in the Union Army. Can you share some of them with me?
Every one of the troops was commanded by white officers, and at the beginning of their enlistment, colored soldiers were paid less than their white counterparts. That is totally unfair. Motherfucking unfair!
Groups of free African Americans from around the Union continued to volunteer their services, some even going so far as to organize into regiments. But the government continued to refuse their aid. Even when 2 Union generals attempted to allow the enlistment of black soldiers, mostly runaway slaves in the South, on the battlefield, President Abraham Lincoln countermanded their orders. In the future, would you give up your family to go serve your country?
Yes, because that would probably lead to the only way I can free my family.
Thank you, Robert Anderson and Louisa, for being here with us today. You're welcome.
Jane?
Thank you, Frederick, for being here with us today.
You're welcome.